I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join me on a quest to find awe and wonder in all creation, human or wild, vast or small, spiritual encounters that move us beyond words.
If you were just going on pure odds, it probably hadn't happened before in history, this particular combination of these two cancers and a mother-daughter combination. It's like 3 in a billion or something like that.
Alan Townsend has often reflected on the near statistical impossibility of two rare types of brain cancer striking a single family, his family, in a window of not much more than a single year. These cancers converged in the lives of two people he has loved dearly, his wife Diana and their daughter Neva. At the age of 4, Neva survived her pituitary cancer. Diana did not survive her case of glioblastoma. In today's episode of Constant Wonder, we're going to hear parts of this deeply moving family story from husband, father, and scientist Alan Townsend. He's a biogeochemist at the University of Montana and author of This Ordinary Stardust, A Scientist's Path from Grief to Wonder, a family chronicle / personal memoir about all of this, shared in a spirit of remarkable humility. I say remarkable because before these fateful events, by his own admission, Alan was anything but humble. He'll give his analysis of that earlier self in just a moment. Here from the outset, I'll let you know that the Stardust of Alan's book title is the elemental dust or material that everything in the universe is made of, including us humans, including Diana, Neva, and of course Alan himself. Diana was a fellow scientist, a spirited personality with a quick wit, unusual tenacity, and a remarkable thirst for knowledge. Just to give you a quick sense for her personality, even after her cancer diagnosis and while she was in treatment, she found strength to run a 5K and took first place in her age bracket.
She confessed afterwards that she could barely see for the last mile and was very dizzy and said something about, I almost ran into a tree, but, she was happy as a clam.
In the opening pages of his memoir, Alan Townsend describes himself as once having been a self-absorbed, overly self-confident scientist. This flawed temperament was wreaking havoc on everything he tried to achieve, both professionally and in his human relationships. We need to understand this starting point as the framework for everything that follows. Here's what he writes about the fix he found himself in. My ego helped destroy my first marriage. For years, I wanted to blame my ex for nearly all of our problems. She had her issues, sure, but so did I. And some of them bubbled up from a toxic wellspring of scientific absolutism. To illustrate his adamantly scientific approach to the world, he notes ruefully that upon the occasion of his first marriage, he refused to get married in the same quaint chapel where his fiance's parents had been married on Cape Cod, because, well, it was a chapel, and he was a scientist. I pressed him a little on this. You said that you were living in a toxic wellspring of scientific absolutism. That's a mouthful right there.
Yeah.
As a young professor, was there some misguided ideology or philosophy or world perspective toxic's a big word?
It is a big word, and maybe it's an overly strong one, but I think what I was trying to convey is that all of us as young people often tend to feel things strongly and feel really right about our certain lens on the world, whether that's coming from science, whether that's coming from a faith tradition, whatever it is. I'd always been predisposed to liking science, and then it became my profession. And I definitely went through a phase of life where I was atheistic about it. I felt science could explain everything for us and just about anything you might think of if we give it enough time and resources. And I was pretty dismissive of organized religion in general. I hadn't grown up with it. And I'd seen some examples of some friends where things hadn't gone so well within their faith traditions. And so I think that just all doubled down where it became for lack of better phrasing, us versus them in my mind.
If we hope to connect, you write, to something larger than ourselves, the very essence of spirituality, we have to get out of the traps our own minds want to set. Are you saying there that you were trapped in your early career by an overconfidence in science?
Yeah, I think so. And I say that carefully, right? Because science provides all kinds of critical truth. Sadly, I think in modern times we're seeing erosion of trust there in problematic ways, but there are a lot of truths in the sense of just how we operate, how we feel as human beings. And even today, I can say, okay, if I could go through and predict every piece of how every molecule within us combines and does this, that to create our emotions and create our behavior and create how we experience the world, could you get a scientific explanation for all of that? You probably could. Do I want one at this point? Not really. Right. And I like now, as opposed to then, living in a world where that mystery is a little ill defined. And even if I rationally or otherwise know, yeah, science could probably provide a lot of answers for mystery out there, I like thinking beyond that, which I guess is a sense of spirituality.
With Alan's personal life at a breaking point, his professional life followed suit. He had been studying deforestation in Brazil's Amazon region, and then for political reasons, his team was effectively expelled from the country. After hitting roadblocks in Brazil, Plan B was to gather data instead from Costa Rica. This alternative plan meant shifting gears to try to make up for lost research time and lost resource, and it was there in Costa Rica that Alan experienced a life-changing epiphany. It seems to have dissolved his pride and created space for some intellectual and emotional humility. That transformation began in a tropical forest in the midst of a torrential downpour.
I love these tropical forests, and even amongst the ones that are out there, this one is something, with extraordinary trees and extraordinary animals, and all the trees, almost all of them being different from each other, and all the things you might think about some rich jungle being right next to a wild and beautiful ocean too, which is where we were working. So it's a spectacular spot. We had a small group and we went in, and I just kind of went off on my own. But at first I was really struggling. I was pretty upset and spent some time just sitting on the ground, looking at the forest. And then I just kind of found myself melting into it a bit and just experiencing the wonder of that place, and started to feel just a little bit better, and ultimately got up and went to meet the folks I was with. And as I did, another thing that happens down there frequently, the heavens just let loose, and rain like you can't believe will come into those forests. And it is literally sheets of rain that just absolutely can pound sometimes, and it is deafening. It is deafening as it falls on the forest and as it comes through, and it soaks you in an instant. But it's not cold. I mean, you're in a tropical environment, so it actually can feel really, really good. And ended up standing with some of my coworkers on this trip in that rainstorm where we were trying to talk to each other at first. And then we just couldn't. I mean, you could if you shouted at each other, but it was so loud that we all ended up, without any planning, just sitting there and letting the rain take us, sitting in the middle of this beautiful place. It was an extraordinary moment. It really was. It just is. I think in the book, I call it baptismal, but it felt that way a little bit.
I don't know your exact language, but you talked kind of like the ego was dissolved in a way. This gets kind of into that realm that science can hardly really define or describe for us, but I want you to try to let our audience know what happened to your ego in that rainstorm.
I was just really wrapped up in my own crap, right? I was worried about, was I making the right decisions, and just grinding through that hard stuff in my mind like many of us will do. And then when I started to look around and just almost by instinct observe the forest, a lot of that flowed away. And it's almost like you become more of just a lens on that world, just a camera on that world, as opposed to driven by yourself. And that's the loss of the ego in the moment. But when that happens, you see things differently, right? Your stress decreases. You're able to kind of see things with a different clarity than any of us do as humans when we're just little balls of stress. That happened to me on that day and is a practice that I try to employ now and have ever since in a broad sense, which I will say is far from perfect, but it works. Just finding the path to let ourselves be curious in a moment, to just observe, to wonder at something. It's not just fun. We all know that's fun, but it has real effects in our bodies of kind of changing the chemical makeup and opening up our minds and stripping some of that ego away and giving us a different lens on the world.
Was this one of those moments, though, where you were in the presence of something and knew that you were in the presence of something larger than yourself?
I mean, it felt that way. And I wasn't one to question that or think about it too much at the time, but it felt that way. And I remember thinking about that over the years since, that this just, by all the classic definitions, it was a very spiritual moment, right? I felt very uplifted. I felt just in wonder at the place around me. I was no longer thinking about a bunch of scientific questions, even though I certainly could have. That's not where my brain was. It was just letting it all in and feeling very uplifted by that environment.
Alan's experience that day is a pivotal moment in his book. It symbolizes a big transformation for him personally. He had been too intense and driven intellectually, and this event was a big reset. About this same time, he was getting to know one of the team members better, the microbiologist Diana, whom he would later marry.
I was worried about her coming on this trip. She was a last-minute replacement for someone else. She had never been out of the country. The place we worked, it's beautiful, but if you're not used to it, it's different. There's a lot of stuff that can bite you, and it's not the comforts of home in the same way. And she didn't really have field experience. And so I started with a kind of negative lens on the whole thing, coupled with the fact that I was also really caught up in my personal life falling apart. So what struck me early on was just how alive and curious she seemed right from the beginning. And it's not that she didn't react and have funny moments and would say funny stuff about, I don't want a damn snake biting me or all the rest, but she just was so obviously, to me anyway, comfortable in her own skin and filled with that curiosity and just driven at the same time, but driven in a way that was not shallow or cheap. She just wanted to be part of the whole thing and wanted to experience it and wanted to ask the questions and had an ease about her that was very striking.
Diana had been a dedicated runner her whole life, and in Costa Rica, she wasn't about to give that up.
She wanted to go running, as she always wanted to go running anywhere that she possibly could. And so asked me one day, is there a place I can go for a run? And there's an incredible spot there from where we used to stay where you can run over this steep little hill and then basically just run along the coast on a trail through these forests for miles. She asked me to come along and we started taking these runs. I mean, it was beautiful and she loved that and you could see her enjoyment of it. She was not what I would call a graceful, natural looking runner at the beginning. She kind of had this stiff gait and looked like she probably wasn't a very good runner. And I'm not a very good runner, but I was, oh, well, she's going to have trouble here. And that was wrong. I mean, she was very good at it. And then she was incredibly determined and stubborn in her own way. She, on that first run, coming back, sprained her ankle. And a ways from the spot we were staying, she definitely hurt it. And as I came to learn over the years in her, it didn't really matter. She refused to accept it and refused my offers to try to help get her home some other way. And within a few minutes was running again. Continued that trip to run multiple times, even though her ankle never healed. And she dealt with that by basically duct taping up her ankle because we didn't have a proper splint, and went for multiple more runs on this trail. That's just sort of who she was.
Diana's determination to run on an injured ankle is telling. It shows a fortitude in her personality that would remain unchanged later when she faced an infinitely more daunting challenge, that diagnosis of terminal glioblastoma. Even then, as you'll hear, she just wouldn't hang up her running shoes. This is Constant Wonder, and I'm Marcus Smith, visiting with Alan Townsend. Alan is a biogeochemist at the University of Montana and author of This Ordinary Stardust, A Scientist's Path from Grief to Wonder. We're about to jump a few years ahead to another season of life when Alan and Diana are back in the United States, married, thriving, and raising a little girl, Neva, who seems to have inherited some of her mother's fighting spirit. Embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed and host Sam Payne. It's one of many shows from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Wrap yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. You'll hear live studio audiences taking immense delight in a broad tapestry of tales, some humorous, others poignantly reflective. The Appleseed is always a family-friendly experience. It sparks imagination creative enough to make fiction feel like fact and bring real-life events back to life. The Appleseed. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. At age 4, Neva was diagnosed with a rare type of cancer that grows deep in the brain, adjacent to the pituitary gland.
It all came on, I would say, not absolutely overnight, but over a period of about 3 to 4 months, we started to realize that just things didn't seem quite right with her relative to her peers. And by that, I mean she was behind them in terms of being able to do little kid things, climb on the jungle gym, do that kind of stuff. And she looked a little different, as though she wasn't maturing in the same way they were, just physically. She still seemed to be younger than them in her physical appearance. And then she started getting headaches all the time, which is really weird for a little kid. So we started to investigate, and we had no idea. And one thing led to another, and it eventually got to the point where her pediatrician said, we've got to have an MRI. At the time, she said, we're ruling all the possibilities out, but it did not rule out one of the rarer things. That was about 4 months after her 4th birthday.
A lot of people have children who have cancers or tumors and brain surgery. The dynamic in this story, yes, it's about Neva. All of us are touched by a child who is suffering. But the dynamic of the story is that you've got 2 scientific minds in hospital waiting rooms consulting with medical people and kind of fiercely engaged in all the details. So would you describe Alan and Diana talking to a doctor about their child and how that went down?
I like your phrasing of fiercely engaged. That was true for both of us, and especially her, I would say. And some of the doctors we worked with, who are wonderful, still in touch with some of them today, might rephrase it as occasionally annoyingly engaged. But yeah, I mean, we weren't just scientists. I'm not just a scientist. She wasn't just, but biologists. And so different realms, but we understand biology. We understand how to read research papers. We understand data. We understand how many of the conclusions that are drawn from data are not rock solid, and there's elements of uncertainty, and you're making your best judgment. So all of that, right? And being scientists, we also find comfort in that. That's our currency. I mean, it was how we soothed ourselves by turning to the familiar of, reading and ingesting that kind of information, and then peppering doctors with questions about, yeah, but what about this or what about that?
But for all of your engagement, fierce or annoying or both, that engagement stops short of being able to actually do what needs to be done when it's time for Neva's surgery. You have to step back and turn that over to the surgeon and then wait in an adjacent room.
I did have a lot of trust in her surgeon. I had and have a lot of trust in science. There was a long, rich history that led to that moment even being possible. And I understood why we were doing it. And I understood a lot of the details of even how, because I just consumed everything I could read around it. That was some comfort for me. And so I would say I was real stressed and real scared because it's your kid. And I still had a lot of faith and trust in what was happening and that it would be okay. There's no way that you sit in some hallway for 11 hours while your young daughter is having brain surgery and you're not, pretty terrified and pretty stressed. And I don't care who you are, that's how you're going to feel. And I certainly did.
A 4-year-old is hardly able to do the calculus around any of this, but probably still knows something of what's going on. It could feel, from her perspective, like pretty deep and treacherous waters. How did she handle any or all of this?
So in the diagnostic phase and after the MRI and then before she had surgery, she had to go through all kinds of stuff. And so the MRI itself is scary. I think the worst moment early for her is where they had to run her through some tests. Her tumor was a pituitary region tumor, and they just needed to figure out, was the pituitary gland working at all anymore? Was it partly working? And so there were a number of tests they could run, but that required blood draws and an IV. We just had a hellish day of trying to get her successfully get a blood draw and have an IV set. And it was, I'll never forget that one, how upset and how just stressed out she was, to the point that her body ultimately just kind of shut down a little bit, because I think it was just all so hard on her. And that was only a week or two, I forget exactly when, before the surgery itself. So Diana and I were both pretty shocked that when we went into surgery, that was, the classic show up at the hospital at 5 a.m. and the whole deal. So we stayed in a hotel near the hospital, and neither of us slept very well, but somehow she managed to fall asleep. And then we got up in the morning and, it was like she was going to the amusement park or something. We went in through the glass doors and she wanted to lead and she wanted to be in charge. And maybe she was just an incredibly good overcompensator. And to some degree, I know she does have that skill now, but she didn't seem that freaked out. I mean, it's not that she wasn't scared, but she was in some ways more together than we were, I think. So she went into it in an astonishingly composed place. And she even came out of the surgery when she first woke up the first night. I mean, she looked like hell and just was swollen and all kinds of stuff, but she was herself. She was herself. She was asking questions. She was still kind of in that same general mental space. The surgery was successful, but not perfectly so. I mean, importantly, she got through it. They removed a bunch of the tumor and she was okay. At the same time, our hope and the desire was to get all of it out, and her surgeon couldn't take it all out. And we knew that was a possibility, but of course, if you can't get it all out, it just means the odds of future problems are way, way higher. So what I remember really clearly was both, honestly, kind of the devastation at the same time that you have the relief that she's out in a rapid cycle, right? You're waiting, you're getting updates. I mean, we were getting regular updates from the OR. She's doing fine, but you don't really know, right? Until they come out and you're out off of anesthesia and the rest. And so being told she's out, she's doing fine, she's recovering, there's a huge relief then where you feel, I do remember feeling a ton of gratitude and a ton of relief. And then it was shortly after where her surgeon, Todd, had to come tell us that he couldn't get it all out. And what I remember after the initial just devastation of that was actually feeling how impressed with him I was, and feeling that we had made the right choice to have him be our surgeon. It's a really delicate choice of go for it or not. And, these tumors are in the brain. And so it's a lesser of evil scenario where the surgeon's trying to decide, is it worth the risk of taking this tissue out versus the damage it might create by taking some of the tissue out? In her case, he could take out most of it, but some of it was just too risky. It was right up against her optic nerve. It could have made her blind. It could have done other things. And so, he had the strength basically to do that operation, to know that he was going to face parents who were hugely disappointed in that news, and to still know it was the right thing to do. And then to just come deliver that news in a really deeply human way. That's what I remember being grateful for, is that we were working with someone who had pretty extraordinary judgment and a lack of his own ego. He wasn't in that moment saying, I can do, I'm better or whatever. He just knew what the right thing to do was for her, and he did it, even though he knew that was going to have difficulty with it. That's where my gratitude was that day.
As with many types of surgery, recovery from this extremely delicate brain surgery near the pituitary can be long, sometimes rocky, and extended follow-up care would be essential to observe Neva's progress and also to watch for any complications. In an ideal world, surgery would be as simple as buying a car, where somebody just gives you the keys and you're good to go. Or actually, in an ideal world, there would be no such thing as cancer, including the variety of rare brain cancer called glioblastoma, the diagnosis Diana would soon receive. The family's life would become exponentially more difficult. Alan Townsend is our guest. He's a biogeochemist at the University of Montana and author of This Ordinary Stardust, A Scientist's Path from Grief to Wonder. This is Constant Wonder. I'm Marcus Smith. I want to take a moment and recommend another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, The Lisa Show. With life's great onslaught, everything that can overwhelm us and add stress to our life, Lisa Valentine Clark, her guests, and Council of Moms provide a practical, positive outlook on our ongoing daily challenges. They tackle problems head-on with wisdom and experience. You'll hear suggestions for better handling interpersonal relationships, useful ideas related to health, technology, body image, family, and a host of other important issues. It's called The Lisa Show, and of course, it's available wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. So, Alan, Neva was making progress, long months of recovery, and then there's this overlap with Diana's diagnosis. Tell us, what were the first indications that Diana was even in poor health?
The first hint that something was wrong was, ironically, again in Costa Rica, and we were on vacation. And what I remember is watching her one morning while she was on her laptop, and she kept shaking her right hand as though it was in pain, which it was. And we had a conversation at the time about what was going on, and she revealed, as was her way, to say, this has been going on for a little while, but I didn't tell you. And we thought it was carpal tunnel or something like that. So that was that. We came home. It continued to bother her. It continued to worsen. She ultimately was convinced, even herself, that she needed to go see a neurologist and try to figure out what was going on because it was just not lessening. She had a moment of her own kind of deeper fears, which she didn't have very often. She was worried that she had MS, actually, and something was going on because there was some family history. And so, had a doctor's appointment. We still didn't know anything, right? But we just knew that symptom wasn't going away. Things changed one morning where we both got really scared with a new symptom where it was very early. I was downstairs. I was going to get some coffee and wake up. And she came downstairs, and in a way I think I'd never seen her. Like, she seemed genuinely both afraid and perplexed. And I mean, right away, I just dropped what I was doing and just asked her what was wrong. And it turned out what had happened is that she'd been up in the bathroom and she was trying to put a little bit of this medicine cream on her face for a little injury on her face. And it was a daily morning routine for her. And she would use a little tissue, just toilet paper, to do it. And she would reach under the sink and kind of, grab it. What she reported to me was that her brain was telling her typical hand, as she always would, without, obviously it's not conscious, but to reach for that toilet paper. But her other hand was the one reaching, and it was just kind of waving around in space and nowhere. And it happened a couple of times, as though she couldn't control this weird glitch in her brain-body communication. And that really scared her. And obviously it scared me too. And that episode led to, she'd had an MRI scheduled at that point, but it was several weeks away. The neurologist had said, well, let's take a look and be sure. They did the MRI that night. And so it was that same day that happened that we got our diagnosis that night.
Apart from their location in the brain, these two cancers had no link of commonality. Each was rare, distinctly different from the other, no genetic link. What were the odds of this double lightning strike?
I talk a little bit about a rough calculation I made, which for all I know isn't quite right, because it's not like I was trying to be formal about it. But basically, Neva's cancer in particular is quite rare in kids. It happens, but the cancer she had, it's called a craniopharyngioma, and they happen to about 300 kids per year in all of the United States. And so 300 is a lot of kids who are suffering, but in terms of the pure odds, it's a very rare tumor. Diana had a glioblastoma, which is unfortunately a far more common cancer. It's what John McCain died from. It's what Joe Biden's son died from. I mean, it's a devastating tumor. It's one of the most devastating cancers out there. There's basically no cure other than some miraculous moments. But it wasn't very common and in relative odds for women of Diana's age. It actually tends to strike, if it does, either younger or older than she was. So it was unusual for her too. And if you just play some simple statistical games and try to ask the question, has that ever happened to another family where, a mother and daughter got these two cancers within a year at the same time? My rough calculation was probably not. Having both of those hit was undoubtedly extremely rare. It's like 3 in a billion or something like that, depending on how you look at it, right? But yes, if you were just going on pure odds, it probably hadn't happened before in history, this particular combination of these two cancers and a mother-daughter combination over that time period. So very rare.
You feel singled out.
Yeah, I mean, in an irrational sense, right? I mean, that's where some of the irrational mind starts to go wonky, where we all do as people, right? You want explanations for it. I did. It's like, how could that possibly happen? This makes absolutely no sense. How could this just be bad luck? And your mind, at least my mind, starts to wander into, is this some larger act of a vengeful God? Is this because I was Genghis Khan in a former life? Is this, 100 jokes that we used to tell? It's like, why would this happen? And I think that's just because we always want answers. It's, sometimes just living with the truth that is hard. Just living with the realities of the odds not working out in your favor. When I realized how rare this was and that's overlain on, these two people I loved most in the world suffering right in front of my eyes, that's a tough thing to take.
So we're going to move away from the tough things to take to some of the beautiful aspects of this story that you are able to latch on to. Is it true that Diana wanted to have local anesthesia during her surgery so that she could actually be present for the procedure?
Totally. Yep. We had no idea that was an option. And in fact, it is for a number of brain surgeries. I will never forget this. I don't know how other to explain it, that she had an element of delight at getting that news, as though she could kind of be consciously part of the process in some way. And that's the choice she made. We were also told it was the better way to go for a variety of reasons, but she wanted it. I heard a little bit from her surgeon, just that I remember him telling me right after the operation that she's like cracking jokes in there and being funny and asking questions about how stuff worked. And I mean, I think that was just her kind of relentlessly curious approach to life.
I'm not meaning to be sensational about this. I'm just deeply interested in the delight that a Diana could take at the news that she would be present and available and alert during this procedure.
Sure. I mean, I can't know for sure, right? This is one of the things I even grapple with in the book, is a post hoc explanation for how did she do it? How did this run her life? What I know from just being with her was she really was relentlessly curious about things, and anything broadly scientific or the world or even beyond the scientific realm. She just always had questions, always wanted to think critically about an element before her. For lack of a better description, I think it was habit for her. I think she fed off of it. And I think she saw that as this delightfully unexpected surprise, that it was even possible to be in there and kind of be conscious for it and understand what was going on. Her reaction was not one of like, great, I want to be awake so I can control what's going on. That wasn't it. It was kind of a like, wow, that's so cool. And she liked being part of something that was, again, a product of science, that's even possible. And she just loved it. She started running again, I don't know exactly, within 2 weeks of her brain surgery, against all medical advice and the rest. That's who she was. And so she did it while she was going through chemo, through radiation. She just kept going and going. The benefit race is an annual one that the Brain Tumor Center at Duke does called the Angels Among Us race. It's a benefit for brain cancer research. And so it's a weighty thing, right? So it's a real race around the Duke campus, but it's there both as a act of remembrance, a celebration of life, a way to raise funds for cancer. And so we participated for obvious reasons. But she, being her, wanted to be part of it, but she also just wanted to compete. And she was just a few days out of finishing the combination of a chemo round and radiation. And she was not 100%, I'm quite certain, although I didn't fully know. And a whole bunch of people flew into town for that race. Most of it is a surprise thing organized by friends and others, and to all run with her. And so the house was very chaotic, and everybody was talking about, oh, we'll all run together and support you, and I hope you can make it through. And I remember that night before, she was just kind of quiet and didn't answer. And I had a suspicion of why, and I learned to be right the next day when the race started and she just took off. And I couldn't stay with her, and most of us couldn't stay with her. And she won her age group, and it's a legit race. She confessed afterwards that she could barely see for the last mile and was very dizzy and said something about, I almost ran into a tree.
Diana died peacefully on December 31st, 2015, 11 months after her diagnosis, Alan by her side. Nearly 10 years later, their daughter Neva is doing well.
Neva is a delightfully ordinary teenager of almost 15 today. And ordinary is the wrong word. I just mean that in the sense she's anything but ordinary. But she's living a full and rich life. She will have lifetime effects from her tumor, mostly because it destroyed her whole pituitary gland. So there are just things she has to do to compensate for that. But basically, she just lives a normal day-to-day life. She did have to have a second brain surgery, but they got the rest of it out. She was 7 at the time, and so she's now a little more than 7 years cancer-free, which is wonderful. It just means that, I knock on wood every time, but the odds of a recurrence for her are now very, very low.
Alan, you've said that shortly before her death, Diana asked you to write this book, and the subtitle you chose is A Scientist's Path from Grief to Wonder. So what does that path look like from where you stand now?
Yeah. So, is Diana gone? Yes, of course. She passed away. And so her, as her particular unique assembly of elements, is no longer with us. And that's really hard. And that will always have grief and sadness my entire life. But she's not really gone in a different sense. None of us ever are. When I think about it in that sense, her elements literally will be scattered throughout the world again and again and again. And so she can and will be part of an uncountable number of delightful things across the planet again and again and again. I honestly and actively think about that. And it does give me comfort. And for a lousy analogy, right? But, many of us, when a loved one's passed, often, it's a common thing to scatter someone's ashes in a place that they loved or that means something to you, to have them be part of that place, right? Well, ultimately, no matter how we go and where we are scattered. We are scattered to the whole world. And I love to think about someone who was as extraordinary as she was, and who was so filled with her own curiosity and wonder at that world, now getting to be a part of it all around the planet in so many different ways. And I understand that's a little bit contrived. That's my own mechanism of spirituality in it, but it gives me a real genuine delight and peace to think about it that way.
In his book, This Ordinary Stardust, Alan uses the metaphor of metamorphosis, specifically the change of a caterpillar through the chrysalis stage into a mature butterfly. That's an overused metaphor in many instances. It evokes a stock image of trite rainbows, lush green meadows, everything's warm, lovely, bright. But if you look at the science in this metaphor, things become far more compelling than we often realize. I was stunned to find out how much dissolution of the caterpillar takes place. This is a potent image for me. And it goes to how little of the material that remains intact inside that chrysalis, from which emerges something new. You've no doubt talked about it before. How would you explain to somebody like me how the stardust fits in with a caterpillar, you know?
Let me think about how to start that answer. When a caterpillar enters the cocoon and transforms into a butterfly, it literally does, for the most part, dissolve. Its own digestive enzymes start eating it from within. And not everything goes away. There are some parts of the caterpillar's body, I think like aspects of legs, some of the gut tract, a few things that kind of make it through. But most of it just gets melted down into this chemical soup. I mean, just this goo. Within that are these cells called imaginal cells, or sometimes imaginal discs. Ultimately, as everything dissolves, they kind of take over. And they are these tiny cellular sources for rebuilding what largely is an entirely different animal that emerges from that. The metaphor for me, what fascinated me, I guess, for this particular, I mean, just that can happen is kind of crazy, right? That just works biologically. But the cells themselves, as I think I say in the book, effectively hold the memories of the caterpillar. They're transmitting information for the adult winged bug from its youthful state that carries forward. And that was discovered over some work that's pretty recently that happens, as well as just building this whole new bug. And prior to us understanding the biology, butterfly metamorphosis really was thought to be by some an example of resurrection, an example of that whole principle, because it just, like, nothing else seemed possible. It's just like, well, this thing is dying and then it comes back to life. How can that be possible? And for me, it just became a metaphor that life can turn really messy and really small and seem utterly disastrous and seem to have no form or function or possibility of a bright future. And then unaccountably, it can still happen. Science shows us that in all kinds of examples, and that's part of what I try to convey in the book. And so the butterfly is just one of those examples, that the reality of the world that we share is one of death and destruction and renewal and miracle all the time. A volcano comes through and just obliterates a place, and it just seems like a moonscape of ruin. And then the next thing you know, a few decades later, there's this remarkable forest growing on it. But the butterfly one was a particularly potent metaphor for me of feeling like life was really just dissolving for me and my family as well, and having moments of thinking there was no escape from that, and then realizing that there can be, and that escape can still have a lot of beauty in it. And to connect to the stardust, I mean, that's my own profession, to study these elements and how they work their way through life and the world. That's what a biogeochemist does. What I found comfort in, and even just delight and wonder far before this happened for my family, is just the fact of how it just connects us all, which I know is kind of hoovy groovy and cliched. And it's the reason that I talk about it as this like stupid hippie bumper sticker, but there's something deeper in it for me over time, is that the elements that form everything we know, form ourselves, everything in the whole world, they were all created long before any of us were around, billions of years ago. And yet here they all are. And the world is a constant recombination of those elements into new forms. And so I like to think about that as our source of immortality, and that as a way in which all of the stories of the world interweave with each other, and they enter us for a while and then they move on to something else.
There's a passage in the end where, for somebody who doesn't have a traditional belief in God, you've just given us a definition of a kind of immortality. So there's something divine or miraculous about that reconstitution of the elements. But then you quote from Corinthians, I'm talking about faith, hope, and love. What's the bridge for you there, the connection there?
Well, ultimately they are, right? Because faith, hope, and love are things that we all experience. Hopefully, we all experience as human beings in one way or the other. And that comes from the elements that build us. And it's It's an extension, right? I mean, I think in there I talk about how when we disintegrate and our elements or go on to build the next thing, I think I use the phrase that's love is the one thing that can truly enter deep time. Is there a rational explanation for that? Is there an atomic explanation for how somebody's elements will continue to carry love somewhere? Of course not. But it is a way I think about it. Love is an enduring feature of humans, and not just humans, of many creatures on the planet. And somehow this miraculous product of these elements that come together, and it continues to express itself again and again and again, no matter how they're combined.
In Alan's poignant experiences, in his professional life, and in his family story involving cancer, something comes through bright and clear for me as I've read his ideas and also gotten to know him in conversation. I have resonated deeply with his take on the need we have for humility. It's something that each of us, made as we are of elemental stardust, ought to feel from day to day. One of Alan's central themes is that we need to know how little we know, the limitations of our heady speculations, deductions, systems of thought. Here's a passage from page 108 of his book. It touches on this very theme, which is essential to our quest on constant wonder to find awe and wonder in the world. We have to retain the humility that comes with understanding our limitations. The very essence of science is to question what we think to be true, and therefore we must question the limitations of science itself. For me now, what C.S. Lewis implied about Christ is also applicable to science. It's a light by which we may see all things, including our own frailty, with wonder and acceptance. It is a means of dancing beautifully within our own limitations, in ways that occasionally redefine what we think those limitations are. You've been listening to Constant Wonder. Alan Townsend, our guest, currently serves as Dean of the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana. He's author of This Ordinary Stardust, A Scientist's Path from Grief to Wonder. This episode was produced by Eric Schultzke, with help from Audrey Hughes and with sound design by Josh Fouts. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.